So my name is Julie Roberts. I am President and Executive Director for the Private Sector Emergency Management Association. I thank all of you for joining us today for our first webinar in a monthly series that we will be doing the rest of this year. Just for a quick little background on what is PSEMA, for those of you who may have come across this either on social media or someone passed the information along. The Private Sector Emergency Management Association was an idea that I had about 1.5 years ago when I realized in order to really start to help businesses respond and recover in disasters, we needed an organization that was run by the private sector, funded by the private sector. And that's really how PSEMA was created. I have a background in government. I was with the Florida Emergency Management Agency for a couple of years where we built out a really robust public-private partnership program. And so taking that concept and coming out and making this into a private trade association is how PSEMA was formed. And there are 9 founders. I brought in people that I've worked with over the years. And so we have 9 founders, and then we have a handful of founding companies. And so the goal today is DRS, which is Disaster Recovery Services, joined us as one of our founding companies about 1 year ago now after hearing our presentation at the Hurricane Conference, and Corey reached out, and so we're excited to have them on board. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask if each of you could just in the chat put your name and the company you're with and any contact information, and that way I know I have everyone's from your registration, but that'll help us capture it and also help all of you on the call see who is joining us today. And then also, if you have questions as Jason goes through his presentation, if you'll put them in the chat, we'll monitor those, and at the end of it, come back and answer those questions and then open it up for discussion as well. I will say one of the biggest benefits I've heard over the last year about PSEMA and why to join is the fact that we're building out a very robust network, not just nationally here in the United States, but also we have some partners that may be on the call from the UK today. So it's just being able to build out this network, and when something happens, coming together. And so we did that in Hurricane Ian. It was a very successful activation for us. And so we look forward to continuing that interaction as we move forward this year, hopefully with a quieter disaster season. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Corey Brandt, who is with DRS, and he's going to do a quick introduction of our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Julie. Pleasure to meet you all. Thank you all for taking the time. I'll be quick because I'm in the airport. I guess lobby is the right term. But we're excited to be a part of this. Heard, like Julie said, PSEMA's introduction about 1 year ago. So at the National Hurricane Conference, I spent a couple years working for FEMA, so it made plenty of sense to see what this group had to offer. And just seeing what we did the last 6 or 8 months has been awesome. A little bit about DRS. We help public and private entities prepare for, respond to, and then recover from disasters. Jason's going to be speaking today on the value of a pre-season to show you all how many steps have been taken ahead of time to prevent less uncertainty or maybe chaos sometimes with the term following disaster. But quick bio of Jason: he's our commercial insurance claims practice leader. He specializes in supervising and guiding professionals to provide a turnkey recovery solution for claims consulting, disaster restoration, rebuild, and debris removal after a loss event. So without further ado, Jason, I'll turn this over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Julie. Thank you, Corey. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. As we mentioned, what we're going to talk about today is planning for a disaster, and in the context of using a preseason. So preseason, I guess, can be different depending on who's on the phone and what's going on, whether your risks are wildfires, whether your risks are severe weather in our tornado alley, whether it's hail, tornadoes, or you're in the Gulf Coast and Southeast region and you're really subject to hurricanes and all that. But preseason, when skies are blue up above, February in a lot of areas is kind of a good time. It's before we get into the March and April severe weather season and kind of the heartland here, and definitely before our June 1st beginning of hurricane season. And so what we like to do here is talk about the pre-planning steps that organizations can take that sort of simplify this disaster planning which has really gotten complicated over the last couple of decades. It was really the late 90s, early 2000s when enterprise risk management became very trendy, and a lot of risk managers were tasked with putting together an overall plan for organizational risk and incorporating a lot of different stakeholders into the planning and developing a robust enterprise risk management solution and business continuity plan. And because that pre-planning step was so complicated and very in-depth, a lot of it just kind of didn't get done. A lot of risk managers maybe saw it as a task that was too large to tackle. It was hard to get stakeholders involved because they were already busy with their different day-to-day jobs. And so what you wound up with was a lot of kind of half-developed plans maybe, and people thinking it was pretty complicated. And if they did develop plans, a lot of them have been in binders sitting on shelves that haven't been updated year to year. And a stale plan where stakeholders have changed and people have left or moved to different roles in the organization is not very helpful to anybody. So what our goal here in this time that we'll have together today is to try to simplify that process. And what we call it in our planning for disasters and our catchy little P for D is just taking a simplified 4 steps of review, identify, implement, and monitor to go through data that you're already using and dealing with on an annual basis, and trying to take a few basic steps under the theory of, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, trying to, put in effort during that annual review process that can help protect your organization and make you more resilient in responding when bad stuff does happen. So our learning objectives here are going to be definitely a simplified approach to this disaster recovery planning, and talk about a few proactive steps that you can take that are really going to help you restore your balance sheet quickly. That's the way we think about it. So at DRS, we want to help our clients recover physically and financially after a loss, but the goal is if you can recover your balance sheet as quickly as possible and get those assets back into operation, you're going to minimize the time element or the business interruption impact to your P&L. And that's the overall objective for everybody at the table, whether it's your organization, whether it's your insurance carrier or whatnot. And so a key step in that is reviewing your commercial property insurance coverage. We're going to cover some things here today that may sound like Captain Obvious, but in over 25 years of doing commercial insurance claims, you would be surprised at some of the confusion and misunderstanding that I've seen in doing claims, everything from mom and pop businesses all the way up to Fortune 50 businesses and kind of everything in between. And there are definitely common themes that you'll see across disasters. So with that, let's get into the first step of our P for D, which is review. So the first stage that they'll say, even when you're doing a business continuity plan or anything, is understanding what your risk profile looks like. And the best way to do that is you're renewing your policy, is you're going to have a loss history, probably a 5 to 10 year loss history. You're probably already reviewing with your insurance broker, but understanding what those losses were, understanding what locations were impacted by those losses, and then reviewing your policy named locations to see, okay, are these locations that we still have? Have we increased our profile maybe in this risk of what happened to location A? And now I've got 5 different locations that we purchased over the last 5 years that have the same profile as location A, enhancing maybe your risk in that fire, flood, hurricane, whatever zone that was. But all this goes into, helping you just kind of look at the landscape, especially if you're a new risk manager to the organization, getting a good look at what is the history here, what's the risk profile look like. And then from there, understanding with the insurance coverage that you are purchasing, the policy that's before you, because, we've mentioned FEMA a little bit on this, but, as far as private enterprise and for profit businesses, you guys aren't going to be eligible for FEMA. So insurance policies and your speed to recover is going to be your only opportunity for indemnification here. So understanding what your insurance coverage is and that risk appetite. And we're going to talk through that in more detail, what that risk appetite means. It's everything from limits to deductibles and everything in between. But then also picking out maybe what predecessors may have done, what's existing business continuity and recovery plans that you have, digging together all the stuff so that you can review it and determine what's going to be pertinent for your risk management plan and how you're going to line that up with your resources. So we want to make sure that we're evaluating all that as we go to develop our plan. So this is our first step in review. Now, within review, we mentioned insurance. We're going to spend next kind of good block of minutes here talking about that. But first, just understanding the key components that are in your insurance policy. Some of this sounds kind of basic, but we're going to get into a checklist in the next slide here to really go through some of the nitty-gritty details. But to make sure you've got everything in front of you to review, first making sure, on the policy cover page, is this the current copy of the policy? Is this policy year that we're reviewing here, so that I know the declarations that are on that. And on the declaration page, it's going to list all your different coverages that you've got available to you. And within that, it's probably going to list policy limits, whether they're dollar values or durations, but understanding and making sure you have all that in front of you for assessment. And then deductibles. We're going to talk more in detail on deductibles here too, because deductibles are typically a confusion point, but this is your access to your policy. This is how you actually get into your coverage. So you definitely need to understand, because especially in risk management, because it's going to be you that receives the call from the president or the CEO after a loss event, wanting to know what's a deductible that applies here and what coverage are we going to have available to us. Within the middle, this is where we'll get into some of the nitty gritty here. Perils. Is this an all risk policy? Is this a named perils policy? Likely that it's an all risk policy if you're dealing with commercial property. But in a hard property market, there's definitely a lot of push from carriers trying to sell by perils now. And so definitely be aware as you're going into these upcoming renewal seasons. Coverages. What do you have and what do you not have? Reading in the body of the policy, and we're going to talk through a lot of those to understand what you've got. And then exclusions. What are standard exclusions? What are new exclusions that are coming about because of recent events, COVID, etc. And then the definitions in the policy, which are key. A lot of times words seem like they mean something, but if they're bolded in the policy, there's a specific definition. We need to make sure we understand that. And at the end, it's endorsements. Endorsements can giveth, endorsements can taketh away. So we need to understand what endorsements may add or enhance in your policy. Is flood excluded and you bought an endorsement to put flood back in, or is that endorsement reducing something that's in the body of the policy? So once we get all this in front of us for our review, we also want to make sure that we've got the current SOV and any other supplements that would be attachments to the policy, because these are going to be all the current documents that we need to review before we get into what we've got as kind of a checklist here. Now we're going to spend a chunk of time here on this slide here going through this, because there are a lot of themes that I see consistently through losses where I've assisted clients that come into play here. And the first seems so captain obvious, but make sure the policy is current. You would be shocked at the number of times after a hurricane that I'm engaged to assist a client, and they've got last year's policy. They've got what was talked about in the binder discussions or the renewal strategy meetings, but either the policy hasn't been issued by the insurance carrier, or the broker maybe has partial copies of it but doesn't have the full copy. So as you're doing this pre-season assessment, make sure you've got all the current documents in front of you as you're going into your disaster season. And that means getting copies of all the policies. We're talking a lot about commercial property here, but you may also have National Flood Insurance Program coverage for maybe high hazard locations that you have. Make sure you've got those NFIP policies. Know what they are for building, know what they are for contents. You may have other policies like stock throughput agreements. If you're a wholesaler or a retailer, it may make more sense for you to cover your inventory through stock throughput agreements that give you better access to coverage, maybe lower deductibles, clearer definitions of what's covered. But make sure you've got all of that in front of you as you're reviewing to figure out what your plan is for recovery. And ensuring each policy is complete, as we talked about kind of on the last one, from the cover page all the way down to the endorsements. You've got everything that's current, it's for this policy year, and that's what we're reviewing. Then once we've got that, we're going to review the applicable limits of liability. Because a lot of times renewals just sort of roll. And what someone maybe fails to recognize is, yes, I've got this property damage limit here, but we've bought 5 different buildings since then. And the overall property limit is now, understated from what we need. Or in our current inflationary period, this no longer represents what it truly costs for me to replace the building. Building costs have gone up 10, 20, 30%, depending on the type of materials. I mean, in 2021, steel was increasing at a clip of 5% a month. And so depending on your structure and what it takes to recover, make sure you've got those and you're reviewing your applicable limits of liability there. And so this applies to not only the property damage, but also time element. Has your business grown? Have you guys branched into new areas? Is the overall time element coverage that you have sufficient? And so a lot of times in a risk management role, you're looking at place coverage, you're trying to get limits. Oh, these are limits that we had in the past, but we need to at least look operational at what the organization is planning for the next policy year to make sure that these limits are sufficient for it. And that's where it's critical to have a current copy of the schedule of values. Okay, again, this is another document that tends to roll from year to year to year. And when you actually look at the value that's on there for the buildings, they may be pulling market values. They may be pulling book values from accounting on your assets, your fixed asset registry. And it may all be based on maybe original purchase prices that are just rolling with a 2% or a 5% increment. And no one's really reassessed what it truly costs to replace that asset. Because your duty here is to report a value under your insurance policy for what the true replacement cost value is. And the broker is going to trust the data that you're giving them because they're placing a lot of policies. They may pressure test a little bit, but the insurance carrier is going to take your SOV at its face value and provide you coverage for that. But what you need to understand is if it is a building you bought 10 years ago and you've just been rolling it at a few percentage of inflation, one, current inflation is crazy right now. And if it was already understated to begin with, then you could be in a very underinsured situation. And I bring this up because just as recently as, last tornado season, I'm working with a client who's got 130 locations on their schedule of values. A lot of them were bought over the course of the last 10 to 12 years. But we had a roof lift from a tornado that caused some interior damage. And by the time we replaced the roof, got the interior and do the interior, we're bumping up against limits. If that building would have burned to the ground, they would have been completely underinsured to be able to replace that building. And this was an eye-opener to them to reassess that, because what you're seeing more and more too in a hard property market, which is definitely what we've been in for the last handful of years, is schedule of values is becoming your limits. So for every location that you're listing there, you could be limited on your property and your time element coverage based on what the value is that you're reporting there. Now, you may have a margin provision in there of 10%, maybe even 20%. But if you're in a situation with the original purchase of a building being a decade ago, and you haven't increased its reconstruction cost, you could be sitting in a situation where you might be as low as 40 or 50% uninsured for a total loss of that building. So how do you address this? A lot of times, if you got a lot of locations on your schedule of values, you can't, eat the whole elephant in one bite. But at least developing a plan to first maybe just do a straight square footage assessment across the building types to make sure that they were within the realm of reason for a complete replacement, whether you're using RS means or Xactimate, of just doing sort of rough order magnitudes for those buildings, just to make sure that those values that you've got on there are within line. And then from there, breaking off a few locations maybe each year, starting with your most critical ones first, and going through and adjusting those values, making sure that you've got them proper. The next is also the other columns in your statement of values. So your statement of values is going to have buildings, it's going to have contents, and it's going to have your time element. So extra expenses or business interruption. And typically it's going to be coverages by those individual statement of values. And what I have seen many times is the business interruption value being parked on like a corporate headquarters or admin building, or contents being parked on maybe, again, a headquarters or admin building and not representing where it's actually located. And therefore, when a loss happens, if you are restricted to recovery in that statement of values there, you are uninsured for those. And it could be millions of dollars of equipment that's just simply reported in the wrong location. And if you don't have blanket values that cover, that contents value across all locations, you could be in an uninsured situation or an underinsured situation. And if you're a location that uses equipment at multiple locations and moves it around, and that's an important conversation to have with your broker to make sure that you are representing it as such, and that you're going to have those values no matter where that equipment is located throughout the year, because you never know when a fire or a tornado is going to hit. The next is confirm and understanding the deductible structure. And this is where I see a ton of confusion, because people will look at their policy and they'll see the all other perils deductible. Oh, I've got a $50,000 deductible, or I've got a $500,000 deductible, or $1 million deductible. But that's only for certain perils. When you get into windstorm, flood, earthquake, or even your time element extensions, which we'll talk about in a minute here, you could have percentage deductibles apply. You could have average daily value deductibles. And these are the ones that confuse a lot of people. And in this hard property market, I have seen percentage deductibles for windstorm going as high as 10%. And some risk managers will be like, well, it's all we could get. But are you really understanding the impacts to that? So without taking anyone's P&L and doing a BI value percentage on that, let's just take it based on weeks. In 52 weeks of operation, a 10% windstorm deductible for your time element coverages means you have to be completely down for over 5 weeks before you even get into your policy and it starts covering you. So as you evaluate the risk appetite for your organization, it becomes critical to think through that. Is it worth us paying more in premium, trying to get that down to 5%? Okay, now we're down to 2.6 weeks. That's more traditional on it. Or the ones that are getting few and far between now are the 3% windstorm deductibles. In a hard property market, those are kind of hard to hang on to these days, but I have still seen them existing. And those are, obviously the best you can probably get in a windstorm. But knowing that those deductibles could apply for your total insured values, meaning building and time element. Okay, so let's say you've got to get a 5% deductible, and it's against, currently the wording says total insured values. That means if I don't have any physical loss or damage, but I do have a BI loss, I still have to soak up a 5% deductible on the building and my business interruption loss before I can get into the policy. Okay, well, if 5% is what you're going to get, can you separate it by unit of insurance? That way, if I only have a BI loss and my building isn't that badly damaged, I cannot claim the building, but just claim the business interruption loss. Or on the flip side, I've got physical damage to the building. Maybe it did a lot of damage to the roof and the exterior of the building, but I'm still able to operate, so I don't have a BI loss. So if I do it by unit of insurance, it prevents me from having to, absorb that 5% of my business interruption value to be able to get into the coverage to repair my building. So it's understanding those deductibles and how that wording applies. So percentage deductibles, you can get those separated out by unit of insurance, then it allows you to claim specifically for building or contents or time element, because those are all separate values and coverages that are listed on your SOV. That difference of TIV versus unit of insurance can be huge in the recovery after a loss event for a hurricane. The next is average daily values. I can't tell you the number of panic calls I've gotten from risk managers saying, hey, I've got a 10-day ADV. What does that equate to? And it's not just 10 days of your business interruption value. We talked about defined terms. Average daily value is absolutely a defined term. And if you are a labor-intensive business, average daily value is only going to allow you to start with revenues and deduct raw materials and purchase services. It will not allow you to deduct labor in the typical definition, meaning that a 10-day average daily value deductible is much heavier to you then 10 days of the business interruption value that you're going to claim, where you have to deduct all discontinued costs. And it may be based on 12 months of revenue following the date of loss of what you would have earned. So if you're not a risk manager that's in tune with what your forecasts are, with what your revenue forecasts are for the next 12 months, you may not be able to do a rough order of magnitude of an ADV deductible. And that way you can understand, a lot of times I talk with manufacturers all the time that are being faced with ADV deductibles. And what we can do is, to try to get more certainty, calculate out what that ADV would be, and then try to pursue maybe something a little less with the insurance carrier in a more fixed deductible for that peril. That way it's more known. And when you get that 2 a.m. call from the president after you've had a fire at your location, you can tell them definitively what that deductible is, instead of, I don't know, I'll have to talk to accounting and get back to you, which is the answer you're probably going to have to give with ADV deductibles. Another one that typically causes confusion is waiting periods. And you're going to see this in time element extensions like service interruption. So take the ice storms that hit the southern part of the US, in 2021, did a lot of damage to the power infrastructure in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, even into Oklahoma. So we had service interruption losses where there was no power for an extended period. And let's say there was a 48-hour waiting period. What does that actually mean? Reading in the definitions is key here, because that waiting period may just be a qualifier, meaning after you've had a service interruption loss of 48 hours, then you go back to hour one and start calculating what your total losses are from that event. You have now qualified to get into that service interruption coverage. Or the 48 hours may be the insurance carrier has no liability until the 49th hour of your loss event. And understanding the differences in that, there's a lot of confusion on that. A lot of times people think that waiting period is a qualifier, and it actually winds up being a limit of liability, especially if you're stretching out into 72 hours or beyond with service interruption or civil authority or ingress egress. So that gets us into reading and understanding the endorsements and how those apply. And this is where we'll get into endorsements like contingent time element. So this, taking the ice storm example, you may be someone who had a supplier or a customer that was impacted. Maybe you weren't, actually impacted. You still had power. You weren't physically damaged. You were operating, but one of your customers or suppliers was impacted by the service interruption outage of the ice storms and either couldn't deliver you raw materials or couldn't take your product. Do you have a claim? Well, contingent coverage is for your direct customers or suppliers if they incur a loss of apparel that you have covered. But service interruption and contingent time element are both endorsements. And so you could be trying to stack those endorsements, which your policy may not allow. There are some carriers out there, and without being a commercial for people, there are insurance carriers that do have contingent coverage that extends to those time element extensions like civil authority, service interruption, ingress egress. So if that happens to your customer, you actually have coverage under your contingent coverage if you've got that wording. There are also some broker forms that are out there that allow that as well too. But understanding how those apply is a difference of, do you have coverage or not after that event? And looking at your loss history, what types of losses have you had, and has your policy actually responded? This really came to light after COVID. A lot of people thought, oh, I have civil authority coverage. So when the government came and they shut down businesses for a time period or deemed certain people non-essential, a lot of policyholders thought, well, I have coverage under civil authority, so I have coverage for this. But those time element extensions only apply if you have them related to a covered peril. So fire, tornado, windstorm. Okay, I've got coverage for all those, but I have a specific policy exclusion for infectious disease and viruses. So therefore, yes, I have civil authority coverage, and there was a civil authority event that shut me down, but it's not due to a covered peril. And this misunderstanding was very broad in the market. A lot of policyholders were confused. They were filing claims. They were even hiring attorneys that were filing lawsuits. And I saw lawsuit after lawsuit get dismissed because, yes, you had civil authority coverage, but it was due to a peril that was excluded in your policy. And so understanding how those things work and how your time element extensions can work or not work after an event allows you to then understand what your risk appetite is, understand what your true exposures are. So understanding those as well as those policy exclusions, which I just talked about, the policy exclusions, for infectious disease, whether it's mold, whether, you may even have flood, is an excluded peril, and even if you are putting it back as an endorsement, you need to really watch because insurance carriers are trying to put some really stiff deductibles, like percentage deductibles, like windstorm on flood. So just be aware of what you've got there. They're putting sublimits on it. They're putting stiff deductibles to access the coverage. So make sure you understand those. And as we kind of taught through some of the examples, understanding the definitions is key. What does it mean for waiting period? What does it mean for average daily value? What is, your business interruption cover? What is your contingent time element cover? Does it cover just direct, or could it also cover indirect? So within those definitions and within the body of those endorsements, there's slight wording changes that you can make that make those endorsements really work for you. So let's take civil authority and ingress egress. So you could have wording in the policy that says prevent. So ingress egress coverage has to prevent access to the insured location. Well, you pretty much would have to be, a flooded island, to be truly prevented. But if that prevent word is instead impair. So let's say I'm a major distribution center off the interstate highway, and the main exit for trucks to get in and out of my facility is flooded out. That is impaired access to my facility. And I may actually have ingress egress coverage for that flooding that occurred that just took the off ramp or the on ramp away from my facility and didn't allow people to access in the normal course. Could they take back roads and maybe still get here? Maybe they could, maybe they couldn't. But that prevent versus impair wording within those time element extensions can be the difference of whether or not you get to use that coverage. Same thing on contingent. Is it just direct customers and direct suppliers? Or could it say direct and indirect? If you add that and indirect, then all of a sudden now I can get into suppliers of suppliers, which could be really important. To give a hurricane example of that one, I had a refinery client who said, hey, the rail was washed out by the hurricane. BNSF can't bring in our raw materials. We can't operate. We've got a contingent loss here because of the physical damage of the rail. We've got rail spurs on our property. It's property of the type insured. We've got coverage. The problem is BNSF was our contracted relationship, but BNSF didn't own the track. CSX owned the track. So that was damage to an indirect supplier. And unless the refinery had a direct contract with CSX, that contingent time element coverage did not trigger. And in this case, it didn't. And it resulted in millions of dollars of having to truck material in and out of the facility that was not covered by that endorsement because of that direct versus indirect customer wording. So it can be critical in the access to that. So understanding that. And then identifying any time restraint requirements on here. A lot of times I see clients that'll have losses and they want to hold back and see whether this is going to be an insured loss or not. And in developing that, they may miss a notice requirement under the policy, or even in reporting the claim, where you may have a 30, 60, 90-day requirement where you just got to get them something so you can continue to work through the claim. So just being aware of those. And then on the back end, filing suit. Is it a 1-year restriction? Is it a 2-year restriction? Understanding that you don't always have to file suit to preserve your rights there, but you need to be aware when you need to ask for a tolling agreement to extend your rights in that. to be able to continue to negotiate that claim. And typically it's going to be a defined period, whether it's 90 days, 180 days, or maybe even a year. Getting those tolling agreements are pretty easy. So this right here is a checklist where we covered a lot, but I hope what you get from this is you really need to dive into the policy and make sure you understand it. It's not just, oh, I have commercial property and I've got X dollar values on BEI, I got X dollar values on property damage. How does it all respond and how does that fit your risk profile? So then that gets us into identify here, which after we've reviewed all the policies, what are some of the key areas for improvement? Can we get that 10% deductible down to 5% for windstorm? Can we maybe even get it to 3%? Or can we get it at least divided out by unit of insurance instead of total insured value? So how can we try to make some improvements? Or can we get that wording in there for not just prevent, but impair, access, to get that civil authority and that ingress egress wording to work better for us? These are things that are just slight tweaks that you can make working with your broker on here, that when you're doing this in a pre-loss situation, can help improve your situation in the next renewal. And the next is disaster recovery team resources. Okay, so I've reviewed the policy, made whatever suggested improvements that I'm going to try to make in a hard property market to get it improved, but a loss still happens. Who's going to be my team to help me respond? First, internally, make sure you've got some key positions there. Obviously, risk management is going to be involved there because they're the buyers of the policy or whoever holds that insurance function. But then also internally, making sure that you've got a point person that you can turn to, likely in the controller's office or some operational accountant, that's going to help you set up a balance sheet account to capture costs. They're going to help you gather all the information you need to document your claim. Insurance claims are he with the best data wins. So you need to make sure that you're capturing all the data on the front end so that you can properly support your claim. And having a key operational accounting person is key to that process. And then facilities, operations, those people that are directly impacted. Who's going to be that point person? Is it by facility, for each location on the SOV? Or is it one person that's maybe regional or national that handles that, that's going to help us figure out what operations are impacted, what is plan B to try to get operations resumed as quickly as possible, and how are we going to do that to expedite our recovery as quickly as possible? Setting up that internal team. And then on your external team, and this could be a variety of players, starts with your broker. Broker is going to be on your external team. Do they have a property advocate for you? Know who that person is and make sure they know you. Make sure you're corresponding with those guys because they are going to advocate for you on all the coverage things that we talked about, over the last 20, 25 minutes. And then also for external, who's going to help you put your claim together? Is there a claim preparer that maybe you want to put on retainer? Do you have professional fees within your policy that can allow you to pay for that person on there? A lot of times you can put professional fees in your policy with a sublimit that allows you to hire somebody that does this day in and day out to help you in putting that claim together. And then the external team can extend also to the insurance carrier representatives. Is there an adjuster that you've worked with in the past that knows your business and that you like working with? Get them named in your policy, not just a brokerage firm. Not just an adjusting firm, but get a specific adjuster named in your policy that you like working with, and your broker can help you do that. And you can also go down to the accountants that adjuster hires as well too, and name them in your policy. If you liked how you worked with them, maybe on past losses, you felt they treated you fairly. The more uncertainty that you can eliminate in this planning process, the better. So trying to get a named adjuster, someone that maybe even their accountants. You've got your internal team. You'll know your property advocate, having a claim preparer. This is kind of a simplified business continuity plan that as you're going through your property renewal strategy, you can set all these, and this is a pretty light lift for you. Now, once you identify these, you also need on the external side, who's going to help you fix all the bricks and sticks and get them fixed up? Do you need to have a remediation firm and a roofing firm and HVAC and maybe temporary buildings? It kind of depends on how deep you want to go into it. But if I would advise one thing, it's definitely making sure that you've got a remediation firm tied in. And we're going to talk about here in the next slide, implementing that for your SOV. So this is implementing this. So we talked about who we want on our external team. So now we've got to implement it, actually create what's going to be our disaster recovery plan. And it starts with those standby contracts for those critical services. This doesn't mean you have to use the vendor, but it means that they've already worked through terms and conditions. I'm sure everybody on this call has fought the fight with legal trying to get a vendor certified. Well, you don't want to do that after you've had a major fire at your flagship facility. You want to do this while there's blue skies outside and there's no loss. Let's work through the terms and conditions. Let's get those vendors qualified. And let's also get their established rate schedules. Remediation firms are going to issue a rate schedule every year. Make sure that schedule's with your insurance carrier. So we've worked out all the terms and conditions. You've put the rate schedule with your insurance carrier. And so when a loss happens, it's as quick as an email or a phone call, and the process begins in that recovery. So you may have relationships with contractors or GCs that help you with improvements or expansions of your facilities, but they may not do disaster recovery type work. These are specialized vendors, and you need to make sure that they know you and you know them. And I would say that working through every location on your statement of values and making sure that you've got standby contracts. So if you've got 3 locations in the same area of the country, maybe one vendor is what you need for standby. If you've got dozens of locations throughout the country, this may be a handful of vendors. Someone to cover you on the West Coast, someone that's really got assets and resources in the South and the Southeast, the Midwest, the Northeast. So you may have 4 different vendors here that you want to do standby agreements with, but the goal is to make sure that they've got the assets and the resources to respond to you, within hours, if not a couple of days after a loss event. So one vendor might not be your silver bullet solution to all of this. And then once you get those standby contracts, making sure that you've got that business continuity plan or BCP on some sort of accessible phone tree, whether it's a portal that everybody knows about, so that your facilities guys know who the remediation vendors that they're going to call are, and those remediation vendors know your facility guy, so that just makes the process happen a lot faster. There can be a lot of people CC'd to kick the process off, but you want to make sure that those terms and conditions, those rates, and that phone tree is built out for all those key points of contact. So you can see here in implementing this plan, it's not the huge enterprise risk plan. This is a process you're already going through each year in renewing your commercial property policy. This is just taking a step further and really utilizing your SOV, your statement of values, and then doing these standby contracts, which are of no cost to the organization, but just make sure you've worked out the times and conditions so that, again, you can restore that balance sheet as quickly as possible. Now, the best way to articulate how this works is a case study. War stories always stick with people. So I want to kind of implement on this. This right here is a case study with a paper manufacturing client that we have that needed a quick recovery after Hurricane Ida. So you might hear this and go, oh, okay, it must be a paper plant on the Gulf Coast. No, they're in Pennsylvania. Because after Hurricane Ida hit New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana, it slowly worked its way up the Northeast, bringing massive amounts of rain and causing huge flooding in New Jersey, New York, and in this case, Pennsylvania. So our client saw their 600,000 square foot facility all of a sudden flooded with 4 feet of rainwater. And this damaged, and I got the bullet list here, all their major pieces of equipment, hundreds of motors on smaller ground level pieces of equipment, whether it's fork trucks, dies, their raw material paper rolls, which you can see the water line here going across, and these paper rolls are huge. You can see the water line here and destroying all the raw material. Paper doesn't work well with water. And then 165,000 square foot finished goods warehouse, which was completely destroyed with the floodwaters and the moisture that those products soaked up. When the insurance adjuster was on site here, just a day or so after, they thought it's going to be best case 2 months, probably 4 months before this place is back in any kind of productive capacity. Now, this client did have a plan, like we just talked about. They'd gone through the locations. They had standby agreements. They had standby agreements for different remediation vendors, one for equipment, one for building. Unfortunately, there one that showed up for building, said, hey, this job's too big for us, we're out. And they left the site. So they called me in a panic over Labor Day weekend because we were also one of their standbys for claim preparation. But we also have access to those physical restoration vendors as well, as we talked about. So we were able to get them another remediation partner, on site in less than 24 hours. And because now we had multiple vendors for contents, equipment, building, they also asked us to project manage this to keep everybody rowing in the same direction, to keep open lines of communication between the adjuster and their building and equipment consultants that they were hiring, and to make sure that we were all marching towards the fastest possible recovery to the facility as possible. And we achieved that. In this case, the client was able to remediate in 5 weeks, okay? And they were producing production at some level, although not full capacity, within 6 weeks. Compare this with the 2 to 4 months of just getting the place mucked out and back to some level of operations that the insurance carrier thought. And this was a great story of how pre-planning worked. And the insurance carrier saw this, and the insurance carrier sees how these guys are a prudent insured that we want to partner with, because they put the forethought into a plan. They could respond quickly, they could get back into operations. And by doing this, they had their internal team lined out. They knew who their accounting folks were going to be. They immediately set up those accounts and started capturing data. So we were able to get 40% of the claim paid within the first 30 days. And by the time we hit 90 days and they were back in production and we knew what those repair costs were, we had 80% of the claim paid within 90 days. So this is huge from a cash flow standpoint. It helped them resume operations and have their policy really work for them in indemnifying them. But it all started with pre-planning and having those teams lined out. So I know we're approaching 12:50 now. I wanted to leave a good 10 minutes or so with questions, but finishing up and rounding out our P for D is the monitor side. So now we've talked about reviewing all the documentation in front of you, seeing how we can improve it, getting those standby agreements for every location on our statement of values. Now we need to keep this up. Can't let it go stale. Let's review this each and every year. Companies are always buying locations, selling locations, changing strategies, adding new products, making sure that our values are in line with that, and that we've got new vendors maybe signed up, or we've expanded our standby agreements to pick up new locations, or eliminated ones that we don't need to worry about anymore. Reviewing those insurance coverage and policy forms, seeing how they're changing from year to year. How has that changed my strategy? And then doing any other annual updates that you might need to do, to that. And this happens every year when you're buying your new property policy. So just take the extra time to review each of those details each year and make sure you're in a good spot for recovery when loss does happen. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Corey and Julie to monitor the chat and see if we got any questions that maybe have come in.
Thank you, Jason. We do have one question. It was from Kathy Colton with American Logistics Aid Network. It was a question regarding the civil authority when you were discussing that. She was asking, would something like the East Palestine train derailment that occurred in Ohio, I believe it was 10 days ago or so, be covered under civil authority as long as that peril is not excluded?
As long as that peril is not excluded, yes. So it's kind of civil authority that's caused by physical damage of the type insured. And so on this, the civil authority could be caused due to pollution. There could be pollution exclusions. I think this one could probably be difficult depending on what's causing it, because the actual derailment or damage to the train isn't what's causing the civil authority. What's causing the civil authority is the risk of the chemical pollution and spills. So I would say to read what exclusions you might have on the pollution coverage, but talk with your broker and definitely their advocate, because again, it comes down to the definitions of what that exclusion is in the policy to see if you may have triggered that civil authority. Also, civil authority has to occur within a certain number of miles typically. The limits could be dollar values, could be days. Typically, it's like 30 days or some dollar value, but they'll typically put a restriction in there, whether it's 1 mile or 5 miles from the insured location that the civil authority is impacting your operations. So if you're inside that circle, then you know that's a good step towards potential coverage. But the next would be, what are the pollution exclusions there that are really triggering that civil authority order?
Thank you, Julie. If there's no further questions, we'll send it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Corey, for joining PSEMA a year ago. And Jason, thank you for this presentation. It was very informative. I got a lot of positive feedback as well from people on the call. We will be posting this up on the website and also on our social media. And so I just want to wrap up really quickly, and I just want to share a slide that we at PSEMA have really come to love. And this is now kind of our new thought, is to be resilient. When you think about what does resiliency mean, it is a rubber band. Being able to stretch but not break, and being able to come back and being resilient and getting back into business. I will open it up. We have about 5 minutes. If anybody has any questions or thoughts, I'm happy to take those now, and then we'll make sure we wrap up on time.
Great. Julie, can I make a comment here?
You sure can. Thank you, Tom.
Hi, Jason, Tom Serio. A couple of good points here. I like your statement about recovering the balance sheet. You know, when I talk to folks, when I talk to IT guys in bits and bytes, but when I talk to business people, it's dollars and cents. And that's really what's going to hit them. So that was a great statement there. This is a very gray area still. And I think one of the important points is staying on top of your plans, on your insurance policies rather. You know, because as the world changes around us, that can have an impact on our coverages and our recoverability. But real quick, give me a 30-second response about cyber and ransom insurance and where that's headed, or what we should be looking at.
Cyber coverage has become tough. Originally, you know, they were writing policies that didn't include much. I was at a major broker in charge of cyber claims and trying to homogenize and develop wording there, where we were trying to get business interruption included in cyber and other coverages. And when they were trying to launch the coverage, they were very willing to take on those items and put them in their policies, whether it was business interruption, professional fees, other items. And you saw property carriers throwing cyber endorsements in their policies, trying to sweeten the pot from a competition standpoint. Now, this was 8, 9, almost 10 years ago. Okay. And then the losses started happening. You know, we had WannaCry, we had other major like global events that hit, and that stung for the insurance carriers. Property carriers that weren't savvy in this area started paying out big claims. So you saw those cyber endorsements in commercial property all but disappear. And even the cyber carriers were taking big hits, because it's not, everybody thought cyber was the loss of personal information was the risk. The real risk to cyber is operational shutdowns. You know, I did cyber claims for toy manufacturers that had their SAP system hijacked and they couldn't manufacture. You know, that was the big loss, not the loss of personal information from the employees. And so those drove much bigger losses. We were seeing 10, 15, $20 million losses against these $25 million cyber policies. So again, carriers started restricting. We saw renewals, we saw limits coming down. We saw a lot of restrictions, and now the cyber questionnaire is an obstacle to a lot of people. You've practically got to hire an IT expert to help you be able to fully answer the cyber questionnaire now, which is putting a lot of risk managers in a panic, because the audit committee has had this coverage now for years. And you've got risk managers having to go before the audit committee and say, we couldn't renew our cyber this year. We failed the questionnaire. And now we've got to hire an IT consultant to help us get in compliance so we can get back to coverage. But right now we're exposed. And so that is the evolution of what I've seen happen over the last 10 years. Cyber is a very hard market right now. Premiums are high, values are low, and the questionnaires are tough to answer. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, Tom, but that is definitely the evolution of where cyber has gone.
No, it's good because it is a difficult area, and I've been kind of looking at it a little bit. But it's funny you say about the data. When they're learning, the professionals are learning that the criminals aren't after the data; they're after the shutdown. They're after the money, right? When somebody does a ransom attack, they know that a company has got a lot of cash. They've got great insurance policies, good payout. It's not the gold is not in the data anymore. The gold is in how much money can we get from a company, through Bitcoin or whatever it may be, to get them access back to their systems or data. So good. I know, tough situation, but thank you very much for your candid answer.
Thank you
And
for the question.
Ron, I think I saw you come off mute. Did you have a question or comment? Oh, you're muted.
No, I was just going to say, I think this kind of a review of insurance coverages and all of the elements that Jason covered is really timely and something everybody doesn't think about ahead often. So I'm glad this came up, and I enjoyed the presentation, and I'm sure everybody will be more mindful now. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ron. That was a goal.
Great. So with that, we are wrapping up the hour. I just want to thank all of you again for being on the call today. A number of you have reached out for information on membership. If you are interested in joining, our website has now been updated. The back end is now, you can go in and actually sign up, which is the easiest way to do it. But if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. We will be hosting our next call next month. It will be Women's History Month. So we're going to focus on women in emergency management and that expertise, because emergency managers and women in that industry is growing over the last decade. And so that will be our focus for next month. And we're also going to be looking to do a online networking event where we can just all jump on a call and talk about what are the issues we're dealing with and how to start building out our network. So when something happens, we're all ready to go. Thank you, Jason. I think this was everyone really enjoyed this presentation, and we'll be sharing it. And if others have questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to pass those along as well.
Great.
So if there's no other questions, I thank everybody for being here today.
Yes, thank you, everybody.